They stopped saluting. In March 1945, across Japanese-occupied territories from Manila to Manchuria, officers noticed their men no longer met their eyes during morning formation. No formal mutiny. No open defiance. Just a gradual erosion of the one thing that had held the Imperial Army together for 4 years, the belief that divine will guaranteed victory. The veterans who survived weren't shocked by the atomic bombs. They were shocked that anyone thought the bombs mattered. Because by August 1945, Japanese soldiers had already spent months living in the psychological aftermath of something far more devastating than any weapon. The moment they realized their generals had been lying to them since 1942. The breaking point wasn't Hiroshima. It was the smell of burning files in Saipan, the silence on the radio after Leyte Gulf, and the 3 words scrawled in a sergeant's diary that his family would find decades later. This is the story of how an empire's soldiers went from absolute belief to silent certainty, and how thousands chose a specific form of psychological survival that would shape Japan for generations. January 1944. Rabaul Garrison, New Britain. Private Nakamura Takeshi reads a letter from Tokyo that arrived 3 months late. His sister writes about victory parades, about American carriers burning, about the Emperor's divine protection. Nakamura folds the letter carefully. He hasn't told her that he watched 18 Japanese planes take off 6 days ago. He counted 3 return. The pilots who came back didn't speak. They sat in silence, smoking cigarettes with trembling hands, and when the base commander asked for their report, the squadron leader said only, "We saw the fleet." The silence that followed told Nakamura everything the official communiqué would never admit. This was the pattern repeating across the Pacific in early 1944. Not dramatic reversals. Just the steady accumulation of small silences that added up to something soldiers couldn't name but felt in their bones. Replacement troops looked younger every month. Air raids came more frequently, but Japanese fighters rose to meet them less often. Supply ships stopped arriving. Rations got smaller. And through it all, Radio Tokyo broadcast glorious victories while men sat in bunkers listening to American naval guns getting closer each week. The Imperial Army had built its entire foundation on inevitable victory through superior spirit. Yamato Damashii, the spirit of Japan, would overcome American industrial might through sheer will and sacrifice. Every soldier believed this as fundamental truth, as unquestionable as gravity. A true Japanese soldier couldn't doubt victory any more than he could doubt the Emperor's divinity. So when doubt came anyway, it arrived as cognitive dissonance so severe that men literally couldn't speak about it. After the Americans took Kwajalein in February 1944, units across the Pacific experienced epidemic-level psychosomatic illness. Men developed tremors, couldn't keep food down, stopped sleeping. The symptoms had no physical cause. What they had was the beginning of mass psychological collapse in a military culture that had no framework for processing failure. Sergeant Ito Masaharu kept a diary throughout his service in the Philippines. The entry from March 15, 1944, 3 weeks after the Americans landed at Los Negros, contains a single sentence: "We are already ghosts." He doesn't explain. He doesn't need to. By March, frontline soldiers had arrived at the same realization. The Americans weren't just winning. They were winning with such overwhelming material superiority that Japanese resistance had become meaningless. Every battle was predetermined. Every defensive position was eventually obliterated by naval bombardment so intense it turned coral atolls into moonscapes. The breaking point came in different forms, but it followed a pattern. For the garrison at Saipan in June 1944, it was watching American ships appear on the horizon in numbers that seemed physically impossible. One soldier later testified he counted vessels for 20 minutes before giving up. The fleet stretched to the horizon in every direction. He realized in that moment that everything they'd been told about American losses, about Japan's naval superiority, all of it had been lies. Then came the realization about leadership. Soldiers could accept losing to a superior force. What they couldn't accept was the dawning awareness that their commanders had known the truth and concealed it. After Saipan fell in July 1944, survivors brought stories of what happened in the final days. The island commander, Lieutenant General Saito Yoshitsugu, had spent the last week burning documents. Not battle plans, personnel files, correspondence, anything that might reveal what Tokyo had known and when. He committed suicide before the final American assault. The survivors who witnessed this understood they'd been sacrificed to maintain a fiction. Then came the silence. This is what makes the Japanese experience distinct. German soldiers in 1945 argued, complained, even surrendered in organized groups. Japanese soldiers went quiet. They continued following orders with mechanical precision while privately abandoning any belief in the war's purpose. Unit cohesion remained intact even as shared conviction evaporated. Men still charged when ordered, still died at their posts, still shouted "Banzai," but they did it as performance, as ritual divorced from meaning. By October 1944, after the Battle of Leyte Gulf destroyed what remained of Japan's carrier fleet, the pretense became impossible to maintain. Radio operators across the Pacific noticed something unprecedented. After major battles, Tokyo would broadcast victory announcements while operators monitoring Japanese military frequencies heard only silence. The fleet wasn't responding because the fleet no longer existed. Ground units listening to both channels simultaneously experienced psychological vertigo. The gap between propaganda and reality became so wide it induced dissociation. A private stationed in Burma described the moment his unit heard about Leyte Gulf. The commanding officer assembled them to announce a great victory. 3 American carriers sunk, the invasion fleet in retreat. The men stood at attention in the rain, listening. When dismissed, they returned to their positions without speaking. That night, the private watched his sergeant sit cleaning a rifle that hadn't been fired in weeks because they had no ammunition. The sergeant looked up and said, "My son is 7. I hope someone tells him I died for something real." Then he returned to cleaning the rifle. The officers knew their men knew. This created a bizarre theater of mutual pretense. Orders were given and followed. Reports were filed. The machinery of military discipline continued operating with surface normality while everyone involved silently acknowledged its fundamental hollowness. Some officers dealt with this through increased brutality. Others retreated into ritual and tradition, conducting elaborate ceremonies that reasserted the forms of military culture even as its content drained away. What replaced belief wasn't cynicism. It was sustained cognitive dissonance where soldiers simultaneously performed devotion while privately preparing for death without meaning. Letters home during this period show a distinctive pattern. Men write about duty, honor, sacrifice. But the language becomes strangely abstract. They stop mentioning specific battles. They stop asking about the war's progress. The letters become exercises in saying nothing while appearing to say everything expected of them. The psychological impact was worst on the youngest soldiers conscripted in 1944 and 1945. A recruit who landed in Okinawa in March 1945 later recalled his first conversation with his squad leader. He asked when they would launch their counterattack. The squad leader, a veteran of Guadalcanal, looked at him for a long moment, then said, "We're waiting for supplies." The recruit asked when supplies would arrive. The squad leader said, "They're not coming. They were never coming. Welcome to the war." By spring 1945, the silence had become infrastructure. Units stopped reporting accurate casualty figures. Supply officers stopped requesting resources they knew didn't exist. The entire apparatus of military bureaucracy continued functioning through institutional momentum, generating paperwork for an empire that was burning. And then, months before Hiroshima, something shifted. The men who'd already accepted death began making different choices about how to die. Suicide attacks increased not because soldiers believed they would change the war's outcome, but because dying in a final charge felt more psychologically tolerable than waiting in a bunker for American flamethrowers. They couldn't choose to win. They couldn't choose to go home. But they could choose the manner and meaning of their death. The veterans who survived to surrender in August 1945 consistently report the same feeling, not shock at Japan's defeat, but relief that the performance could finally end. When Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15, soldiers across the Pacific wept not from grief at losing, but from the sudden collapse of psychological pressure they'd been sustaining for over a year. The bombs gave them permission to stop pretending. The silence didn't end with the war. It became a defining feature of post-war Japanese society. Veterans didn't talk about the moment they stopped believing. The official narrative spoke of noble sacrifice and unfortunate defeat. The private reality of slow psychological collapse remained unspoken, passing from veterans to their families as inherited silence about what war actually does to certainty. That sergeant who cleaned his empty rifle in Burma made it home. His son learned his father had served. He never learned about the night in October 1944 when his father sat in the rain and acknowledged he was dying for nothing. The rifle went in a box. The diary stayed hidden. And the moment when belief ended remained one more thing Japanese soldiers knew but never said. But this wasn't the first time an empire's soldiers stopped believing before the empire admitted defeat. What happened in the frozen forests outside Leningrad would reveal something even darker about how long leaders can sustain a lie when the price is paid in other people's lives.